Welcome to another episode of History Hutter's Signature Edition. This is where I take items from my collection of autographs that I have assembled since I was a kid in 1973 to teach you a little bit about history. Today we're going to talk about probably an unpleasant subject. I wanted to talk today about some politicians who are in my collection who died in airplane crashes, and there are a lot more than you think there are. I struck upon this idea when I was up in South Dakota last year, and I saw a mention of George Mickelson Memorial Park. And obviously it sounded like somebody important had died, and indeed, I didn't know anything about it. George Mickelson was a 52-year-old governor of South Dakota. Here's a signed photo of him that I recently purchased on eBay. It was like $14. It was ridiculous. It also came with a letter that he sent to somebody in 1992 in answer for an autograph request. And he signed this letter as well. Him and 8 others were in Ohio. They were doing some kind of economic development attempt. They were flying back on the state-owned aircraft. It was a Mitsubishi MU-2. And somewhere over Dubuque, Iowa, they had a catastrophic engine failure. Something on the prop came loose. It ended up flying into the cabin, injuring somebody. Of course, the pilot lost control over the aircraft. It was April 19th, 1993. Fortunately for those on the ground, it was sparsely populated. He was over farm country. The plane went down on a farm, it went into a silo, it burst into flames. Unfortunately, everybody on board the aircraft were killed. 3 days after the crash, on April 22nd, approximately 12,000 South Dakotans filed past his coffin inside the Capitol Rotunda there in Pierre, South Dakota. A couple of them actually had stopped to admire this large picture of the governor smiling, and I just wonder if maybe it was this portrait that was hanging there next to his coffin. I didn't know anything about George Mickelson. He sounded like he was a popular governor that a lot of people really mourned the loss of. And then there's a story of Ron Brown, who was the U.S. Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton. A lot of people remember the Ron Brown funeral because there was some video of President Clinton who was joking around with people at the funeral. And then as soon as he caught a view of the camera, all of a sudden you see him shedding tear and acting sad. A lot of people made fun of him for that. I was fortunate several years ago to get a signed photo of Ron Brown. Again, it was just dirt cheap, and I'm not sure why nobody was interested in this, but as a historical figure, I thought that was pretty cool. And there's also a letter that I got with that. It was signed on Democrat National Committee letterhead, 1992. He's just answering an autograph request, but there's the signature on that. So what happened? He was on a large aircraft. He was with 35 people. There were 6 military crew members aboard, 29 civilians, 33 were Americans. And over Croatia, the plane crashed on top of a mountainside. It was just a devastating air crash. Nobody survived. Out of all the air crashes, I think the one that John Heinz went through was the one that kind of touched me the most. When I was a kid, I wrote to Senator Heinz. He was kind of considered presidential timber at the time. John Heinz was a wealthy politician, and he came from the Heinz ketchup family. And I wrote to him because I obviously thought he was going to be president someday. This is a letter that he signed. I think I probably asked him if he was going to run for president. Basically, he's just saying, I am committed to serving the people of Pennsylvania well, so I may be reelected to the Senate in 1982. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to represent my fellow Pennsylvanians in the United States Senate. With warm regards, John Heinz. And it came with a signed photo, a black and white signed photo that basically said, best wishes, John Heinz. And then later I obtained another signed photo, probably hitting this mic here. This signed photo of John Heinz, good looking young politician. He certainly probably could have run for president. He was a rising star in the Republican Party. On April 4th, 1991, a series of tragic missteps led to his death. Senator Heinz was traveling to a meeting in Philadelphia on board a twin-engine Piper Aerostar plane. At some point, the indicator light that indicated that the landing gear had malfunctioned had gone off, so they weren't sure if they could land. Those at the control tower said land anyway because you could usually survive those kind of landings. It just messes the plane up. But there was a helicopter crew in the area. They said, you know what, we'll volunteer, we'll fly by, we'll take a look and see if your landing gear is down. Well, the landing gear was down. They just didn't know if it was locked into place. And they wouldn't have been able to tell from the air anyway. So the helicopter was hovering just below on the left side, and then somehow they went underneath the aircraft and it's all theory as to what happened at that point. But the two collided right over a school ground, raining down debris. There was a 6-year-old first grader who was killed by the flaming debris, and then there was a 7-year-old second grader who was severely burned. Things could have been far worse had either aircraft hit the school building, where there were approximately 570 students. The plane crashed in front of the school and the helicopter behind it, clearing the roof by just inches. It would have been far tragic 15 minutes later when hundreds of children would have been on the playground. Senator Heinz's body was identified by the band of his wristwatch and his American Express card. Now, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board later confirmed in their accident report that there is really no visual way to confirm a front landing gear is locked on an aircraft, calling it an appallingly poor judgment by the pilots to accept the offer of a close visual inspection by the helicopter crew. Now, the NTSB also criticized both flight crews for attempting to conduct their in-flight inspection over a densely populated area. Furthermore, the NTSB stated that once the pilots of Senator Heinz's plane had visually confirmed that the gear was down by seeing it in the reflection from the plane's propeller spinners, there was no further need to inspect. Now, in a strange twist of fate, the day after Senator Heinz was killed, former U.S. Senator John Tower, who was a very powerful politician from Texas, actually, I wish I could tell you this was a signed photo of him, but this is the auto pen. The infamous auto pen signed this. So this isn't authentic. I do have another one. I'm not going to get it out right now. But it was on April 5th, 1991. The senator was with his daughter and with NASA astronaut Sonny Carter and 20 others. They were in a twin-engine turboprop plane. They were flying from Atlanta to Brunswick, and outside the Glencoe Jet Center, something catastrophic happened. The aircraft went down, and everybody on board was killed. The National Transportation Safety Board investigators looked into the crash, and they determined that the controller for the propeller unit actually malfunctioned. It changed the angle of the blades, and therefore it lost lift. Your props actually change depending on how you want to fly. You probably know that air traffic in Alaska is necessary because of the vast amounts and the fact that there's not a lot of road systems in Alaska. The only way to get from point A to point B in Alaska is to fly. So Alaska per capita has more air crashes than any other state. Now I want to focus my attention on Ted Stevens. He was a senator from Alaska, and I had written to him while he was still in office, and he signed this one in a ballpoint pen. I later got another signed photo. It's made out to a David Friedman. Maybe you guys have heard of him. I haven't. It says, any friend of Marlo Cook is a friend of mine. Ted Stevens, U.S. Senator for Alaska. He was a legend in Alaskan politics, and he brought home a lot of pork barrel projects for Alaska, including the Bridge to Nowhere. He was a decorated World War II pilot. In fact, he had survived a 1978 plane crash. He was the longest-serving Republican senator in history. You probably also know that the International Airport in Anchorage is named after Ted Stevens. So he had retired from the U.S. Senate. He was 86 years old. Him and 9 others were aboard a plane. It was a 1957 de Havilland DHC-3 Otter. King had just taken off from Dillingham, crashed into a hillside 17 miles north of this Alaskan fishing town. It's believed that his pilot, who had suffered a stroke in 2006, had been stricken somehow and was therefore incapacitated. The plane went down. Now, also on the plane was a former NASA administrator by the name of Sean O'Keefe. Him and his teenage son Kevin were aboard. They were longtime fishing buddies. They only broke bones, and others had passed away. Now, we've all heard about Amelia Earhart and her air crash. Obviously, she went down somewhere in the Pacific. Nobody knows where she is. When you talk about political air crashes, it's this one. Hale Boggs. He was a Louisiana congressman. He was flying with another congressman up in Alaska. It was October 16th, 1972. The wreckage has never been found. They don't know what happened, and it still remains a mystery today. Hale Boggs was the father of Cokie Roberts. You may know her. She was a commentator, I believe, on ABC News. I could be wrong. Could be another network. Him and Congressman Nick Begich were on their way to Juneau, and they were never found. To this day, they're buried somewhere either in the ice or somewhere underwater. We don't know. Some have suggested that Boggs was the target of foul play. So 18 months after the crash, Peggy Begich, who was the widow of Congressman Begich, married a man named Jerry Max Paisley. After the marriage, Paisley was convicted of murder and was serving a life sentence. Now, he claimed that Boggs' plane was intentionally brought down by mobsters who had planted a bomb aboard. Boggs not only served on the Warren Commission, but he grabbed headlines in 1971 when he boldly went up against J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful director of the FBI. On April 5, 1971, Boggs gave a floor speech denouncing FBI and Hoover, comparing their methods to tactics of the Soviet Union and Hitler's Gestapo. Boggs called upon Attorney General John Mitchell to demand Hoover's resignation. Boggs specifically charged that the FBI had wiretapped congressional offices and staged agents on college campuses to spy on students.
Numerous members of Congress have reported to me their firm conviction that their telephone conversations and activities are the subject of surveillance by the FBI. Several members have made available to me detailed information confirming my own experience, which substantiates these allegations. It is my intention to make proper use of this information in the very near future. When the chief law enforcement agency of the nation violates a law, then we're indeed in trouble.
Documents which were later declassified have proven that Boggs' accusations against the FBI were true. Now, there was a strange incident with Congressman Boggs. It happened on July 23, 1970, 2 years before he disappeared. He was in his Lincoln Continental. He was run off the road in Washington, D.C. He had chased the car down. He wrote down the license plate number, and then he called the police, but there was no record of the incident being investigated. I continue to collect autographs as an adult and still do. Obviously, I'm not a kid anymore. In 2000, I wrote to the governor of Missouri, Mel Carnahan. Unfortunately, this is not signed by him personally. It's one of those form letters that they can even reproduce a signature with. Basically, he talks about Missouri being very proud of its state and its citizens, mentions Truman, Omar Bradley, Walt Disney, to name a few. Also, the significance that it had in the nation's development. This letter is actually dated July 26, 2000, and it was October 16, 2000, when the two-term governor of Missouri was flying through the fog and rain. His plane went down in a wooded area about 25 miles west of St. Louis, specifically near Goldman. Now, Governor Carnahan was a pilot, and so was his son Randy. Randy was flying the plane. On that day, Carnahan was on his way to a campaign event, and he was challenging U.S. Senator John Ashcroft for the U.S. Senate seat. Somewhere on the trip, his son got disoriented, and there was some problems with the instrument panel, and the plane went down. His widow, Jean, actually became governor. That's another thing that I quite haven't figured out. Why, when a public official dies, or is killed, dies of a heart attack or whatever, the wife is considered to be the one to take over. Now, this happened with Governor Wallace, I believe. It also happened with Senator Hubert Humphrey. And then Jean Carnahan took over. And Bill Clinton was at the funeral. And I have a picture here of Bill Clinton looking at the widow. Killed in the crash were Governor Carnahan. He was 66. It was his son Roger, or Randy was his nickname. And then there was a campaign aide by the name of Chris Seifert. He was 37. They all perished in the crash. Governor Carnahan is buried in the Carson Hill Cemetery in Mill Spring, Missouri. I also received this auto pen signature of Mel Carnahan. Not one of the ideals that I like when I ask for autographs, when I used to write for autographs, because nobody responds anymore. There was another acquisition that I made. This was like $14 or something. It's a letter that's signed by Earl Snell. He was the governor of Oregon. It was dated in 1944. It's a letter basically to somebody who I think he knew, maybe a friend of his son, because it mentions it doesn't seem very long since your graduation announcement came to us from California, and here you are clear across the country. I can imagine that you were having some interesting experiences, Marshall. Now, this was a crash that was totally on the pilot error. So it probably wasn't the wisest thing to do. The weather turned really bad. It was October 28th, 1947. The governor and his top two officials wanted to go fishing, and they departed in this plane, encountered some bad weather outside of Klamath Falls. They were coming up to a hill, and apparently the pilot misjudged the altitude while trying to stay under cloud coverage. He flew right into the ridge, sheared off several ponderosa pines, and just killed everybody on board. In fact, the aircraft wreckage is still there today. There's a memorial there. There's pieces of the aircraft that are still there, and you can still go up there. So when the governor dies, the succession in Oregon goes to the Secretary of State. He was also killed on the plane. If the Secretary of State isn't around, then the succession goes to the President of the Senate. He was also killed on the plane. So the Oregon state government had been essentially decapitated. Of course, there have been other deadly plane crashes for politicians. It was on May 1st, 1928, the New York Congressman Thaddeus Sweet became the first sitting member of Congress to die in an airplane accident. After breakfast that morning, Congressman Sweet and pilot Army Lieutenant Bushrod Hopkins took off from an Army observation plane, which was a Curtiss O-1B Falcon, in Washington, D.C. to fly to Oswego, New York, where he was to make a speech. The plane encountered such bad weather between Birminghamton and Cortland, New York, so the pilot decided to land in a field in a farm near Whitney Point, New York. The ground was rough and flipped the plane into a somersault and killed Sweet, who unbuckled his safety belt too early, while Lieutenant Hopkins walked away. Sweet is buried in the Rural Cemetery at Phoenix, New York. And then there's the tragic plane crash that took life of Republican Montana Governor Donald Nutter and 5 others. It was on January 25, 1962. Their plane crashed during a snowstorm. After only a year in office, the governor was en route to a speaking engagement in Cutbank when winds of 100 miles an hour tore the right wing from the Montana Air National Guard C-47 Skytrain, which crashed into the mountainside near Wolf Creek. Governor Nutter is buried in the Sidney Cemetery in Sidney, Montana. It was on December 8, 1972, when a United Airlines jetliner went down when it was approaching Chicago's Midway Airport. Now, aboard was Congressman George W. Collins, a Democrat, and 42 others. Collins' widow, Cardis Collins, succeeded her husband in the Congress. California Congressman Jerry Pettis, who was a former military pilot, was killed on February 14, 1975, when he was flying his private plane and it crashed into a mountain near Banning, California. His wife Shirley Pettis replaced him in the House 5 days later. One of the most tragic things that I learned about in doing this video was that Missouri Congressman Jerry Litton was killed with his entire family in a plane crash in Chillicothe, Missouri. He was en route to a victory celebration on August 3, 1976, after winning the state's Democratic Senate nomination when the plane went down right after takeoff. They were riding in a Beechcraft Baron, and it lost power when a crankshaft broke on one engine. The plane plummeted. Unfortunately, the victims were all burned beyond recognition. They included the congressman, his wife Sharon, and their children, Linda and Scott. There was pilot Paul Roop Jr. and the pilot's son, Paul Roop III. Georgia Congressman Larry McDonald, he was killed when Korean Airliners Flight 007 was shot down by a Russian fighter on September 1, 1983. On August 7, 1989, Texas Congressman Mickey Leland, who was a Democrat who chaired the House Select Committee on Hunger, was killed when his plane crashed during a trip to inspect relief efforts in Ethiopia. He is buried in Golden Gate Cemetery in Houston, Texas. 6 days later, on August 3, 1989, Mississippi Congressman Larkin Smith was killed as a passenger on a Cessna 152 that crashed into the woods in southeastern Mississippi. Pilot error and hazy conditions were ruled in the probable cause of the crash. On October 25, 2002, U.S. Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota was killed when his small plane crashed in Eveleth, Minnesota. Also killed were his wife Sheila, daughter Marcia, 3 staff members, and 2 pilots. The crash site is now a memorial and historic site. So I want to thank you for getting to the end of this video, and I hope it doesn't scare you from getting on an airplane in the future, because statistically air travel is the safest way to go. Often we get in our cars and we don't think about the dangers of it, but when we get on a plane we keep thinking, oh, this thing could go down and I could end up, But that usually doesn't happen. So unfortunately it did happen to these men and some of their family members who were with them at the time, and the pilots. I would love to hear what you thought of this video. What struck you about it? Are you scared of flying? Do you remember any of these men? If you could also give us a like, and if you could subscribe to History Hunters, we would appreciate that as well. Thank you.